Students, let's get into this and let's take ourselves through these questions. And at the topmost part of this page, I've been actually asked to explain why submerged hydrophytes have highly dissected leaves. And to begin us off, we are supposed first to understand that plants can get classified into several categories depending on the habitat or the ecological conditions where they are actually found. For example, I'll actually begin with the hydrophytes. We have plants such as Elodea, water lily, water hyacinth, and salvinia. These are just examples of hydrophytes. These are plants which are actually able to thrive well or to survive in areas which are well watered, areas with a large amount of water. So they are plants that always strive to ensure that they can withstand this challenge of having an excess amount of water within their environment where they are growing. And we as well have what you call halophytes. Halophytes, such as the mangrove trees, are able to thrive or survive in an area which is salty or in an area which has a higher concentration of salts. You see, so at the end of the day, they can be found in salty areas, salty soils, or salty water bodies. Those are halophytes. And you can also be able to get another example that you can always be able to refer to as mesophytes. Mesophytes are also referred to as the terrestrial plants. Plants that can thrive well on our normal land surface. In a normal areas, for example, the maize plants, the bean plants, the mango trees, plants that thrive well in an area that have what you call an average amount of water. Areas that are not too dry or not too wet, just in an environment which is just well watered, but the water is not in excess in that area. So they are just normal plants that normally grow on our normal land. They are called terrestrial plants or mesophytes. And a good example can be the epiphytes, which can actually be able to grow to a very high level or to a very greater height to facilitate trapping enough sunlight during photosynthesis. And apart from the hydrophytes, the halophytes, and the mesophytes, you have what you call the xerophytes. These are well adapted to survive in areas such as the deserts. They can thrive well in arid and semi-arid areas. The baobab, the acacia, the cactus, those are plants that thrive well in areas which are actually having an inadequacy of water. So they have a bigger challenge of ensuring that the small amount of water they can obtain from the environment where they are growing has to get retained within their structures and not again lost to the environment, because there's already a problem of an inadequate amount of water in the environment where they are trying to thrive. So the cactus, the acacia are examples of those plants. And of course, they have different ways in which they can be able to survive. If someone just picks an example of the xerophytes like the acacia or the whistling pine or the cactus or even the baobab, these plants first have deep roots so that they can be able to absorb any traces of water in the lower levels of the ground. These plants have reduced leaves in size. You see, their leaves are needle-shaped or they actually become rolled, you see, so that a smaller surface area can get exposed to the environment to reduce on water loss through transpiration via the stomata. These plants have what you call a reduced cycle. They have what we call a short life cycle to evade drought. And some will actually survive as bulbs or combs, as underground growths to ensure that they actually escape drought. These plants have few stomata on the upper part of their leaves and more stomata on the lower part of their leaves so that they can be able to reduce on the rate of water loss. The same plants have stomata which are smaller in size so that there's a reduced rate at which water can get lost from these plants. The same plants have sunken stomata that accumulate water vapor, and with that they can be able to reduce the saturation deficit or the difference in the amount of vapor between the stomata and the outside, and this reduces on the rate of diffusion or loss of water in form of water vapor from these plants to the surrounding. You'll find these plants having succulent stems, and these stems can be able to actually store water. For example, the sisal, they have succulent stems, they have juicy stems that can be able to store water that can get used later when there's what we call a higher or a longer period of drought. The same plants have what we call superficial roots that run on the soil surface. They can be able to help in absorbing any water from the soil surface when there exists a light shower in those areas that these plants are able to survive. So those are just some of the ways in which these plants can be able to survive well in that environment in terms of reducing on the water loss. If you look at hydrophytes, for example, one, they have what we call dissected leaves, as you have actually been told here. Why? They are actually telling us these hydrophytes are submerged. So they are found in the water. Their leaves are actually submerged. The leaves are not on the surface of the water. So the leaves have a limited access to sunlight, and yet these leaves require enough sunlight to photosynthesize. So their leaves, of course, should be able to actually become dissected, to be reduced in size, to appear thin-like, so that light, which is limited in terms of its penetration into the water, can actually cover a shorter distance so as to reach the light-sensitive stomata and be able to find its way into the chloroplasts within the leaves. The hydrophytes grow in areas which are well watered. The hydrophytes can either be floating or submerged. When the hydrophytes are submerged, that means their leaves are covered by water. So the leaves do not have an access to enough sunlight from the sun to manufacture food. So what happens? Their leaves become dissected, of course, of these plants. When they become dissected, they become very reduced in size, thin-like, so that when light finds its way into the water, it will cover a shorter distance, reaching the light-sensitive chloroplasts within the leaves of these plants, so as to actually maximize on the manufacturing of food by these plants. The chloroplasts are very sensitive to light, so that any limited light reaching the chloroplast under the water can get well trapped and be able to get utilized in making food. The leaves are dissected to reduce the distance covered by the traveling light through the water to reach the chloroplasts for the purpose of photosynthesis. You'll find that these hydrophytes do not have well-developed roots. They have poorly developed roots so that less water is absorbed for the purpose of reducing on the absorption of water. And most of these hydrophytes, if not submerged and they're floating, will be able to actually have a larger surface area. And of course, if the leaves have a larger surface area, a bigger surface gets exposed to the surrounding and end up increasing the rate at which these plants can lose water. The stomata are more on the upper surface than on the lower surface to also increase on the rate of water loss. The stomata are of large size to increase on the rate of water loss. Look at that. And of course, they do not have sunken stomata. They do not have sunken stomata. And you'll find most of them having floating flowers for the purpose of fertilization and pollination. So most of the flowers are floating to facilitate the process of pollination, the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. It is very difficult for these pollen grains to get transferred from the anther to the stigma when these flowers are submerged. So most of the flowers and fruits become buoyant or float on the surface of the water to facilitate fertilization and pollination as well. So that's just all about this. And of course, you may actually want to talk more about the halophytes, like the mangrove trees. You'll find their roots called the pneumatophores getting to that point of actually growing on the upper surface of the soil. They come to the surface of the soil to facilitate the process of breathing, because in waterlogged soils there might be an inadequacy of air. So pneumatophores, or the breathing roots of mangrove trees, which are actually examples of halophytes, will actually be able to grow on the surface of the soil to increase the rate at which gases exchange can take place. You see, and you'll be told that most of them have what you call salt glands. So they tend to accumulate a lot of salts within their structures so that they can actually be able to offset that imbalance in terms of osmosis, so that normally water can get taken into these plants via osmosis as usual. So they have what you call the secretory glands that can actually secrete the excess salts from the structures, you see, and that can just be able to facilitate their way of surviving in the areas where they're actually growing. Mesophytes, as you've actually been told in your normal classes, during your classes as well, you'll find them having an average number of stomata on both the upper and the lower, so that equally, not more and not less amount of water can get lost. And you'll actually find them growing very tall to a very great height to reach the upper part of the sky, so that they can be able to actually get enough sunlight. In terms of competition, they'll be competing in terms of growing, so that they can maximize on the absorption of sunlight from the sun. They have a well-developed root system, with others developing what we call prop roots to just enhance support or anchorage in the soil. And you'll also be able to find them having sensitive chloroplasts if they tend to grow just below other tall plants, so that they can be able to absorb maximum sunlight for the purpose of photosynthesis, you see. And of course, we've actually answered that question. The submerged hydrophytes have leaves which are dissected so that light, which is limited in terms of supply, can penetrate the water and reach the sensitive chloroplasts when they cover, or when it covers a shorter distance. Now, the experiment setup shown below was used to study a physiological process. So there's oil on top of this. That means the oil prevents entry of air into the water. And of course, if this plant is actually placed into this tube that has this water, the roots are going to take in water via which process? Osmosis. So the physiological process getting tested on in this case is osmosis. And that means the roots take in water through osmosis. The surrounding has distilled water. The water represents a hypotonic environment. The cell sap of the roots or the root hairs represent a hypertonic environment. So water molecules move from a region of low concentration outside the plant to a region of high concentration inside the cell sap of the root hair, and that facilitates the uptake of water. That's why in this case, you've actually realized that the level of water has actually reduced, to mean that there must have been an uptake of water by this plant. Look at this. And in this case, there's not any change in the level of water. That means no water has been absorbed, no water has been lost. The oil level prevents entry of air, and as well prevents any evaporation that might occur in as far as the loss of water in the surrounding through transpiration. Because if these two parts will get left open and the sunlight, what happens? The sun rays reach the surface of the water. They heat up the surface of the water. What happens? Evaporation occurs, so water can get lost, and that may not be able to give us an accurate aspect of how these plants can take in water through osmosis. So the oil prevents entry of air into the water that might interfere with the uptake of water by the root hairs, and as well prevent the loss of water in form of water vapor to the atmosphere via evaporation. Very good. So there was not any change in the height of water in this case. No water was absorbed, no water is lost because of this oil layer. In the second part, because of this, we are actually expected to have found a reduced height in terms of what we have here as far as what is concerned. Why? Because the plant takes up water through osmosis as a physiological process. That's why there's a change in the height of the level of water in this test tube. Okay, if given the function of oil in the experiment shown above, yeah, so account for the observation made in A after the experiment. The plant took up water using its root hairs through osmosis because the surrounding is hypotonic while the cell sap of the root hairs is hypertonic. That's why there's a change in the height of the water level in the test tube. What was the role of the setup B in the experiment? To act as a control experiment, to confirm that really, indeed, plants take up water using their roots through osmosis. Because if there's no any plant here, and there's actually an oil layer here, that means no water is getting lost, no water is getting absorbed by no plant, which is not even here. And that means, in this case, expect the level of water to drop because of the uptake of this water by the plant. So it acts or serves as a control experiment to confirm that really indeed plants take up water by osmosis using their roots. Okay, we're done with that. Explain why plants in low altitude experience higher rate of growth than those in high altitude. Remember this. In a higher altitude, the atmospheric pressure is low. You're just trying to imagine this is actually a mountain. This is a plant in a low altitude. This is a plant in a high altitude. At this point at a higher altitude, the rate of water loss from the plants is very high. Why? There's what you call low atmospheric pressure. So the pressure getting exerted on the leaves of these plants is low because the higher you go, the cooler it becomes. So the atmospheric pressure at a high altitude is low. So the rate at which plants can lose water to the surrounding in form of water vapor by the stomata is very high. That can cause stunted growth in these plants. But at a low altitude, the atmospheric pressure is very high. That means the rate of water loss from these plants is very low. That can facilitate a higher rate of growth. Why? Because water is required in plants during photosynthesis and to make the cells turgid and offer support to the plant, and also provides a medium for different metabolic activities within the plant. So that means when water is lost in excess in a plant, that can cause an abnormal or stunted growth. Okay, a person climbing a mountain experiences increase in number of erythrocytes in their blood. Explain. Erythrocytes are red blood cells, and you said red blood cells one are biconcave in shape to increase the surface area for the transportation of oxygen. How? Red blood cells have a pigment called hemoglobin. And of course, there are different types of pigments, both in plants and animals. We have what you call chlorophyll as a green pigment in plants. We have what you call hemocyanin. We have what you call chlorochlorine in annelids and mollusks. You see, we have what you call hemoglobin in vertebrates and some invertebrates like the earthworms. So at the end of the day, you realize that red blood cells have a red pigment called hemoglobin in animals like human beings. That hemoglobin combines with oxygen to give us what you call oxyhemoglobin. And oxyhemoglobin aids in the transportation of oxygen. It is a very unstable compound. So that when this compound reaches to where a cell is that requires oxygen, that compound dissociates into oxygen and hemoglobin. Oxygen diffuses into the cell, then hemoglobin comes back to pick more oxygen from the lungs. So erythrocytes are needed during the transportation of what? Oxygen. Erythrocytes are manufactured in the bone marrow of short bones like the vertebrae forming the backbone or the vertebral column. We said we have 33 vertebrae along the vertebral column, 7 within the cervical region, we have 12 within the thoracic region, we have 5 within the lumbar region, we have 5 within the sacral region, and we have 4 within the caudal region or the tail part or the coccygeal. And those vertebrae, that 3 number, in their bone marrow, we expect to find red blood cells getting manufactured. Red blood cells can also get manufactured in short bones such as the sternum and the ribs. Unlike the white blood cells or the leukocytes, which are manufactured in the bone marrow of long bones like the femur or the thigh bone. So a person climbing a mountain experiences an increase in the number of red blood cells. Why? Because as you go up the mountain, the concentration of oxygen drops. there's a lower concentration of oxygen higher up in the mountain. So that means the numbers of red blood cells must increase to increase the carrying capacity of oxygen. Look at that. So you are going up a mountain, you are expecting to find a lower concentration of oxygen. The amount of oxygen in the atmosphere up a mountain is lower. So to increase the carrying capacity of this limited oxygen up the mountain, the number of red blood cells must increase. The number of red blood cells must increase to provide enough hemoglobin so that the carrying capacity of oxygen by these red blood cells increases or is well taken care of. Okay. Now, we have actually been given here another question, question 7. The following are the blood vessels in a human being. Which letter represents the blood vessel that? So, this must be a vein, this must be a capillary, and this must be an artery. Now, we are always told that veins have a wider lumen, and their walls are thin, less elastic, and less muscular. Veins have valves throughout their network to prevent the backflow of blood. So, in other words, one, veins have a wider lumen. Veins have thin walls. Their walls are thin, their walls are less elastic, and their walls are less muscular. So they cannot actually contract and relax to generate enough pressure to push this blood to flow under high pressure within these veins. That's why blood flowing in veins is under low pressure. And because blood flows through veins under low pressure, the veins must have valves throughout their network to prevent any backflow of blood and to facilitate the flow of blood through the veins. In terms of what we call the forward flow, you are advised to do exercise because major veins in the body of a human being are found between muscles. So any form of exercise that can actually make the muscles to expand, relax, and contract can possibly exert some pressure on these veins, forcing the forward flow of blood in these veins. And of course, you know very well, veins carry blood back to the heart. You get? Veins carry blood back to the heart. Which blood? Deoxygenated blood, except pulmonary vein, which carries oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. So veins carry blood which is actually deoxygenated back to the heart. The blood the veins carry is deoxygenated back to the what? To the heart. Except pulmonary vein that carries oxygenated blood back to the heart from the lungs. And of course, we also have what we call the umbilical vein. Umbilical vein that connects the mother and the child also carries oxygenated blood from the mother's bloodstream to that of the offspring to facilitate the transportation of nutrients and antibodies from the body of the mother to that of the offspring. And exchange of these nutrients occurs what you call through a process called the diffusion via the synapses. And there's no any direct contact between the blood of the mother and that of the child. So veins have nothing like the pulsating action. Their walls are very thin. They are carrying blood under low pressure. They have valves throughout their network. The blood flows back to the heart, which is deoxygenated from the body tissues. And if you look at an artery, the lumen is narrow and the wall is thick, more muscular, and more elastic. The lumen is narrow, the wall is more muscular, more elastic, and very thick. So because the wall is thick, muscular, and elastic, then that means the contraction of these walls, of these arteries, generate very high pressure. So blood in arteries flows under high pressure in a pulsating action because of the muscular nature of this blood vessel. You see, blood flows in pulses. That's why you can actually be able to determine your heartbeat by just placing your finger on your wrist bone or just somewhere near to your neck. You see, and that can actually be able to help you determine or detect the rate at which blood can be able to flow, and of course under high pressure. literally to add on this, you can be able to actually take this at home, that the blood in arteries flowing under high pressure does not require arteries to have what you call valves. So the blood flows and no any form of what you call backflow of blood. It produces what you call a pulsating action. The blood has to get carried away from the heart to all parts of the body. So blood is carried from the heart to all parts of the body. Exit pulmonary artery carrying blood which is deoxygenated from the heart to the lungs. But the other arteries carry oxygenated blood to different parts of the body, with aorta being the major artery that carries blood rich in oxygen from the heart to all parts of the body. Umbilical artery carries deoxygenated blood from the circulatory system of the child to the circulatory system of the mother. If you look at capillaries, they have what you call an ultrafiltration. Capillaries are able to get found almost everywhere in the body. They are very near to the cells. They ensure that nutrients and oxygen are supplied to the cells and waste products are removed. Look at that. They are one cell thick to reduce the distance covered by the diffusing substances. And substances can move out of the capillary and into the cells via what you call ultrafiltration or pressure filtration. Ultrafiltration or pressure filtration. Ultrafiltration or pressure filtration. Yeah, so that is it. So let's come back to the questions. Which letter represents the blood vessel that experiences pulsating action? That is C, as an artery. Has valves along its length, that is A, that must be a vein. Supplies blood to every tissue of the body, that's a capillary, that is B. Why is vessel B the only one that experiences ultrafiltration? Because it is one cell thick. Hence, any slightest pressure within that capillary can force the fluid part of the blood to actually get filtered to any region surrounding the cells. And from that region, we form what we call an ultrafiltrate. That's where now the cells can actually obtain nutrients and oxygen. Ultrafiltration or pressure filtration occurs in capillaries, which are one cell thick. The fluid or the liquid part of blood containing nutrients and oxygen is able to actually get forced out of this capillary into the surrounding cells to form what we call the tissue fluid. That's where the nutrients can actually be able to get extracted and get used by the cells.